There's a specific kind of love that doesn't leave when the person does. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't show up dramatically. It just sits there, quiet, underneath everything else you're doing, underneath the new routines you built and the distance you created and the version of yourself you've been working on since they left. It sits there like something left on a shelf. You keep meaning to move, but never quite do. And you don't think about it every day. That's the strange part. Some weeks you barely think about it at all. You feel good. You feel like yourself. You feel like whatever that was is finally behind you. And then something small happens. A song. A place. The specific way the light looks at a certain time of year. The way someone laughs in a tone that sounds nothing like them, but somehow reminds you anyway. And it's back. Not loud, not devastating, just present. Just there. That low hum underneath everything that says you haven't fully let this go yet. That's love that lingers. And I want to talk about it honestly, because nobody really explains what it actually feels like to carry something like that, or why it stays long after logic says it should be gone, or what you're actually supposed to do with it. First, let's be clear about what this is, because love that lingers gets confused with a lot of other things. People mistake it for obsession, for not being over someone, for weakness, for proof that you haven't healed or haven't grown or haven't moved on properly. But that's not what it is. Obsession is constant. It consumes your present. It makes every room feel like they should be in it. It hijacks your attention and won't give it back. That's not this. This is different. This is the residue of something real. It's not interference with your life. It's just the honest weight of having loved someone genuinely. The emotional imprint they left. The way certain parts of you got shaped by being close to them that you can't fully unshape just because the relationship ended. You can be fully healed and still have this. You can be genuinely happy, genuinely present in your own life, genuinely open to new people and new love, and still carry a soft version of this, because it isn't about being stuck. It's about having felt something real. And real things leave marks. That's not failure. That's just what love does when it meant something. Here's what nobody tells you about the people who linger. They're usually not the ones who loved you the most, or the ones you were with the longest, or the ones the relationship made the most logical sense with. They're usually the ones where something was unfinished, where the connection felt genuine in a specific way that was rare for you, where you got close enough to see something real in them and let them see something real in you, and then it ended. Not because the feeling wasn't there, but because of timing, or fear, or circumstances, or because one of you wasn't ready, or because you were both real but incompatible in some fundamental way you couldn't get around no matter how much you wanted to. Those are the ones that stay. Not the easy ones. Not the ones where everything made sense. The ones where something felt right at the level underneath logic and still couldn't sustain itself. That specific combination, real feeling plus unresolved ending, is the formula for love that lingers, because there's no clean conclusion to process, no dramatic finale to file away, no clear story of what happened and why and what it meant. Just something that was and then wasn't, and a part of you that never quite got the explanation it needed to let it go all the way. There's a version of this that lives in the body, and it's worth talking about because most people focus on the mental side of carrying someone. The memories, the thoughts, the replaying, but the body holds it differently. You'll be somewhere doing something ordinary and your body will react before your mind has a chance to catch up. A smell, a texture, a particular quality of silence in a room. Something physical that was connected to them gets encoded somewhere in you. And when the trigger appears, even years later, even when you think you're completely fine, Something in your chest shifts, something tightens or softens or goes quiet in a specific way that is theirs and nobody else's. That's not crazy. That's not you being dramatic. That's just how the body stores attachment. It doesn't file things the way the mind does. It doesn't organize experience into a clean before and after. It just holds it. In the muscles, in the breath, in the automatic responses, you can't always override just by deciding to. Some of the people you've loved live in your nervous system. That's a strange thing to know about yourself, but knowing it is better than being confused by it, because when your body responds to a trigger and your mind says, I thought I was over this, you're not regressing, you're not broken. You're just experiencing the honest truth that love doesn't just live in consciousness, it lives in the whole of you. And the whole of you takes longer to update than the part of you that makes decisions and writes journal entries and talks to therapists. Be patient with your body. It's holding things faithfully, even when you wish it would let go a little faster. Let's talk about the what ifs, because love that lingers is often what if love. What if the timing had been different? What if you'd met 5 years later when both of you were more ready? What if you'd said the thing you didn't say? What if they'd said the thing they didn't say? What if you hadn't been so scared? What if they hadn't been so scared? What if circumstances had just bent slightly in a different direction and the outcome had been different? You play those scenarios, not obsessively, not constantly, but they visit, quietly, in the spaces between other thoughts, in the particular silence of Sunday evenings, in the gap just before sleep when the mind hasn't landed anywhere yet, and it drifts toward unresolved things like water, finding the lowest ground. And here's the complicated truth about what ifs. They are both a coping mechanism and a trap. They're a coping mechanism because they let you hold on to the feeling without having to fully grieve the reality. As long as there's a version of the story where it could have worked, you don't have to completely close the door. You don't have to accept the full finality of it. You can keep a small space open, where in another timeline this person is yours, and they're a trap for exactly the same reason. Because that space you keep open is also space you can't fully fill with anything real. It's an emotional room you've reserved for a ghost, and while it's reserved, you can't fully inhabit your actual life. The what ifs feel like love, but what they actually are is grief refusing to finish. And finishing the grief means accepting something harder than any what if scenario. It means accepting that the story was exactly what it was, that the timing was the timing, that the ending was the ending, that what happened happened and what didn't happen, and that the version of the story where things went differently doesn't actually exist. That acceptance hurts in a very specific way, a final way, and most people avoid it for as long as they can because it forecloses something they weren't ready to foreclose. But it's also the only path to actually being free. There's something specific that happens when someone you loved moves on before you did. And it's worth naming because it hits differently than most other kinds of pain. It's not just heartbreak. It's a collision between the world you were still inhabiting in your head and the world as it actually is. You had this internal space where the connection still existed in some soft, unfinished form, where you hadn't fully let go because the story didn't feel fully told. And then you see them somewhere new, with someone new, building a life that clearly doesn't have a space for you in it anymore. And it's not even that you want them back necessarily. It's that seeing it makes it undeniably real in a way that the absence alone couldn't quite achieve. Because absence leaves room for maybe, for one day, for timing just hasn't been right yet. But seeing them choose someone else removes the maybe, makes the door not just closed but locked. And something in you that was still quietly waiting has to finally stop waiting. That moment is its own specific kind of grief. Not louder than the original loss. Sometimes quieter, but final in a way the original wasn't. And it asks something of you that the original loss didn't quite ask. It asks you to completely release the version of the future you were still, even slightly, holding on to. And releasing that version of the future is one of the loneliest things, because you grieve something no one else knew you were still holding. Something you maybe didn't even admit to yourself you were still holding. You grieve in private for something that was never announced, for a future that never existed anywhere except inside you. That grief deserves to be honored, even quietly, even just by yourself, even just by sitting with it long enough to let it be real before you move on. Here's something I think about. Why do we hold on to certain people so much more than others? Because you've probably had relationships that ended and felt real grief and then moved through it and came out the other side and honestly don't think about those people very much anymore. You can think of them warmly without it costing you anything. It's just memory. Clean, and then there's this other person who maybe wasn't even in your life for very long, who maybe you never even had a full proper relationship with, who you maybe only had something partial, something that never quite became what it was building toward, and that person costs you something to think about even now. There's still a little pull, still a residual something. What's the difference? I think the difference is the specific combination of being seen and being unfinished. The relationships that become just memory are usually ones where you felt seen, and then it ended in a way that felt complete, or ones where you never quite felt seen enough for it to matter as deeply. The ones that linger are usually ones where something genuine happened between you and the other person. Something felt recognized and reflected back, and then it ended without the recognition being revoked, without you getting the closure that would have told you that what you felt was one-sided or mistaken or less real than it seemed. When someone truly sees you and then leaves without explaining why, or without disputing what you felt between you, you're left with this unresolved equation. The connection was real. The ending doesn't negate the connection, but the connection no longer exists. Those three things don't resolve neatly. And in the absence of resolution, the mind keeps returning to the problem, keeps trying to solve what hasn't been solved, keeps carrying the weight of something that doesn't have a clean conclusion. Being seen is rare. When it happens, even imperfectly, even briefly, it attaches. Not because you're weak, because you're human, and humans are wired to attach to the experience of being genuinely known. Let's talk about the difference between love that lingers and love that's keeping you stuck. Because they can look similar from the outside and feel similar internally, but the distinction matters enormously. Love that lingers but isn't keeping you stuck looks like this. You carry a soft warmth for this person. You think of them sometimes with a mixture of tenderness and bittersweetness. You don't actively check on them or seek information about their life. You don't measure new people against them. You don't keep yourself emotionally unavailable in their direction. You can think of them, feel the feeling, let it pass, and come back to your actual life without losing ground. Love that's keeping you stuck looks different. You find ways to stay connected that you justify as coincidental or casual, but are actually intentional. You're not fully available to new people because there's always this comparison happening underneath. Azra, you make decisions in your present life with this person somewhere in the equation, even when they have no actual role in your life anymore. You're not building toward your future because part of you is still oriented toward a past that involved them. One of these is just honest human emotional residue. The other is a way of not living your life. And the question to ask yourself honestly, without judgment, is which one you're in. Because if it's the second one, it's worth understanding why. Not to shame yourself, but because something about this particular attachment is serving a function for you. Maybe it keeps you from having to be vulnerable with someone new. Maybe it keeps you from having to fully commit to the life you're in. Maybe the longing feels safer than the risk of loving someone fully in the present tense. People sometimes hold on to love that lingers not because they can't let go, but because they're using it to stay just slightly removed from their own life. And understanding that is important because then it becomes something you can actually work with rather than just something that happens to you. Here's a question worth sitting with. What did this person represent to you beyond who they actually were? Because sometimes what lingers isn't fully them. Sometimes it's the version of yourself you were when you were with them. The version that felt more alive, more seen, more willing to be real. The version that laughed easier or opened up more honestly or felt like you were finally in the right place at the right time. And losing them wasn't just losing a person, it was losing access to that version of yourself. Chani, because that version of you existed in the context of them, came out in the specific environment of their attention and their energy, and the way they made you feel safe enough to be less guarded. And when they went, you couldn't find your way back to that version of yourself without them. So the longing isn't fully for the person, it's for yourself. The self that felt most real when they were around. That's important to understand. Because if that's what you're actually missing, then the path back to it doesn't run through them. It runs through you. Through figuring out what conditions allowed that version of yourself to exist and recreating those conditions in your own life, independent of anyone else. What made you feel safe enough to be that open? What gave you permission to be that version of yourself? Was it them specifically, or was it something about how they treated you that you could ask for from other people? Was it something about where you were in your life at the time that you could return to with intention? You don't need them to be that person again. You just need to stop waiting for someone else to give you permission to show up fully. There's something tender about the first time after a love that lingers, where you meet someone new and you feel something real. Because it comes with this complicated mixture of feelings that don't all make sense together. There's excitement, genuine excitement, the aliveness that comes from new chemistry with someone who interests you, and then almost immediately underneath it there's this strange guilt. Like feeling something for someone new is a small betrayal of the thing you've been quietly carrying. Like moving forward means closing something you weren't sure you were ready to close. And then there's fear, because the last time you felt something real, it cost you. And now here's this new person, and the feeling is real again. And your nervous system remembers exactly what the last time cost you, and it isn't sure you can afford to go through that again. So you hold back slightly, not enough for the new person to necessarily notice, but enough that you're not fully there. Enough that you're still watching from a slight distance even while you're physically present. That's not betrayal of the new person. That's just the honest consequence of having loved someone and lost them in a way that didn't fully close. So you can't simply will yourself past it. You can only move through it slowly at the pace that feels honest, while being fair to the new person about where you actually are. Because the worst thing you can do to someone new is let them believe you're more available than you are. Let them invest in something you're still too protected to fully receive. That's not fair to them, and it's not honest about you. Real availability, the kind that makes a new love possible, requires you to have actually finished the previous thing. Not to have forgotten it, not to pretend it didn't matter, but to have genuinely processed it far enough that there's real space in you for something new. Space that isn't borrowed. Space that's actually yours to give. I want to talk about what love that lingers teaches you, because there is something it teaches that almost nothing else can. It teaches you what you actually value. Not what you think you value. Not what you list when someone asks what you're looking for. What you genuinely, viscerally, undeniably value in another person. Because the people who linger are usually the ones who gave you something specific that you hadn't found easily elsewhere, something that felt rare, and the fact that it lingers is your own heart telling you exactly what matters to it. Pay attention to that, not as a way of chasing this specific person, but as information about yourself. What was it about them that made the connection feel real in that specific way? What did they offer or reflect or allow that felt so different? What did the experience of being known by them feel like? What did it bring out in you? Those answers are a map, not to them, to yourself, to the kind of love that would actually work for you, to what genuine compatibility looks and feels like in your specific nervous system, to what you should stop settling for because you now know the difference between what settles the body and what keeps it slightly on edge even when everything is technically fine. Love that lingers is painful, but it's also instructive. It's your emotional intelligence gathering data, and the data is valuable. The question is whether you use it to guide your future or just carry it as nostalgia. Here's something hard. Some love that lingers is love that was never fully real in the first place. And that's uncomfortable to examine, but it's worth doing. Sometimes what lingers is a projection, a version of someone you constructed from their best moments and whatever you needed them to be. You fell in love not with who they fully were, but with who you glimpsed in certain lights. And when the relationship ended, you didn't lose the real person because you never fully had them. You lost the version of them you built in your head. And that version, the one you built, was everything you needed. Of course, it lingers. You made it. This isn't something to be ashamed of. It happens when the connection was intense but brief, or when there was enough chemistry to feel real but not enough time or depth to see the full reality of who the person was. Your mind filled in the gaps with the best possible version and you fell for the composite. The uncomfortable question is, if you'd had the chance to know them fully, with all their inconsistencies and limitations and human messiness, would it have been what you imagined? Would the love have survived contact with their complete reality? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the connection was real enough and the glimpse was true enough that the fuller knowing would have deepened it rather than diminished it. But sometimes the honest answer is probably not. And in those cases, what lingers isn't love for a person. It's love for an idea, for a possibility, for the feeling of that particular connection rather than the actual human being. And you can honor that feeling without confusing it for something that would have lasted. You can acknowledge that it was real as an experience without making it more substantial than it actually was. Because grieving an idea is different than grieving a person. And me knowing which one you're doing changes what you need in order to heal. There's a quiet courage in letting something linger without trying to fix it, without trying to force closure that isn't ready to come, without demanding of yourself that you be fully over something on a schedule, without pathologizing the fact that someone who mattered to you still matters to you even now. A lot of people spend enormous energy trying to stop the lingering, trying to feel nothing when something appears that reminds them, trying to be so healed and so over it and so fully moved on that the residue has nowhere to live. And in doing that, in fighting so hard against the lingering, they make it louder. Because what you resist persists. What you try to force out just digs in. The quieter path is allowing. So, letting the feeling be there without making it mean something catastrophic, without letting it interrupt your present, without using it as evidence that you're broken or behind or haven't processed things correctly. You loved someone. It didn't work. It still sits in you somewhere soft. That's allowed. That's actually appropriate. That's what love does when it was real. The goal isn't to become someone who carries nothing. The goal is to carry things in a way that doesn't prevent you from living fully. You can carry the weight of a love that mattered without being stopped by it. You can honor what it was without being defined by what it isn't anymore. You can feel the bittersweet of it when it comes without surrendering your present to it. That's not being stuck. Nishin Sun, that's just being someone who is loved and carries the honest evidence of it. Here's something I believe about love that lingers after enough time has passed. It stops being about them completely, and it becomes about you, about the part of you that came alive in that connection, about the softness that was possible, about the version of you that was brave enough, or open enough, or present enough to let someone in that far, about what you're capable of. And carrying that, not with grief, but with a kind of quiet respect, is actually something worth doing. Because it's evidence that you can feel deeply, that you don't do things halfway, that when something real is in front of you, you know it and you meet it fully, even knowing the risk. That's not a small thing. That's rare. A lot of people protect themselves so thoroughly that they never let anything fully land. Never let anyone close enough to matter enough to linger. They move through connections at a careful distance and feel safe and also feel nothing that really sticks. You let it land. You let them matter. And yes, it costs you, but the cost is also the proof of the depth. And that depth is yours. It belongs to you. Not to them, not to the relationship. It lives in you and it goes wherever you go. And it means that when love comes again that can actually stay, you have the capacity to meet it in full. That's the inheritance of love that lingers. Not just the ache, not just the what ifs. The knowledge of your own depth. The certainty that you are someone capable of real feeling. Someone who can be reached. And that is worth something. Quite more than it might seem right now while the ache is still fresh. But in time, you'll understand it the way you understand most true things. Quietly, slowly, when you're not looking for it. In the middle of something ordinary. I want to say something to the person who's been carrying this for a long time. Years, maybe. Longer than they feel like they should have to. Who's embarrassed by it. Who thinks they should be over it by now and is confused about why they're not. You're not broken. You're not behind. You're not pathetically attached to something you should have released ages ago. You're someone who loved something real. And real things don't evaporate on schedule. They don't bow to the timeline your pride has set for them. They go at the pace of actually processing, which is slower than anyone wants it to be and faster than most people allow it to be because they keep interrupting it with distraction. If you've been carrying this for a long time, the question worth asking isn't, why can't I let this go? The question is, what hasn't been fully felt yet? What part of this grief is still sitting unprocessed? What truth about this relationship, or about yourself through this relationship, hasn't been fully looked at yet? Because lingering is sometimes just the heart's way of insisting that something still needs to be felt before it can be filed away. Not thought about more. Felt. There's a difference. You can think about something endlessly without actually feeling it. You can analyze a relationship from every angle without ever sitting with the raw, uncomplicated sadness of it. Sorry. And until the feeling has been fully felt, the mind keeps returning to the territory, trying to process something through thought that can only actually be processed through emotion. Let yourself feel it, fully, without the analysis, without the lesson hunting, without trying to extract the meaning while the feeling is still happening. Just sit with the sadness of it, the specific loss of it, the honest grief of something that mattered and ended and left a mark. It won't last forever. Nothing does, but it needs to be given its time. And giving it its time is not weakness. It's the thing that actually finishes it. And then there's this. The moment when love that lingers finally softens into something you can simply be grateful for. It doesn't happen suddenly. It doesn't happen because you decided to be over it. It happens because enough time passes and enough life happens, and you've grown far enough from who you were in that connection that when you look back at it, it starts to feel like it belongs to a version of you that you love but are no longer quite inside of. The ache becomes tenderness. The what ifs become a quiet acknowledgement that things went the way they went for reasons that make sense in hindsight, even if they were confusing at the time. The grief becomes something you can look at directly without it pulling you under. And then eventually, something quieter than all of that. Gratitude. Genuine gratitude for having loved something that real. For having let yourself be that open. For the way it shaped you. For the specific beauty of what it was, even if what it was couldn't last. For the version of yourself it called forward that you've since found other ways to keep alive. That's where it ends up. Not in forgetting, not in indifference. In something that feels a lot like peace. A warm peace. The kind that holds the past without being pulled backward into it. That can look at something and say that mattered, and I'm glad it did, and now I'm here in this different life that also matters, and that's okay. That's where love that lingers is headed, even now, even while it still stings. That's the destination. You'll get there, maybe not today, but you're already moving toward it. With every day you show up for your actual life. With every moment you're present in what's real instead of lost in what was. With every small choice you make to be here, fully, in the only time that's actually yours. Pues, the love that lingers doesn't have to leave you. It just has to stop leading you, and when it does, it becomes yours. Not a weight you carry, a part of who you are, quiet, soft, present. Like something left on a shelf that you finally don't need to move anymore. That you look at sometimes and feel a brief and genuine warmth, and then turn back to your life. Because your life is where you are, and where you are is worth being. Fully. Without apology. Without one foot still somewhere else. Here.